Mark sat at his kitchen table, the letter in his hands crumpled from hours of nervous handling. Mark had never been particularly close to his aunt, but the sudden news of her death and the inheritance she had left behind made him pause in the midst of his busy, stressful life. The letter began as one would expect, formalities, a few words about her passing, but then it mentioned the house, Margaret's house, the place she had lived alone for as long as Mark could remember. She had always kept to herself, never really involved in family affairs, and Mark had rarely visited her. He couldn't recall the last time he had been inside her house, but he remembered the way it looked from the outside, an old Victorian-style home at the edge of town, surrounded by overgrown trees, its windows dark and uninviting. According to the letter, Margaret had left him the house in her will, along with everything inside it. Mark, now in his early 30s, stood at a crossroads in his life. He had been drowning in work for months, feeling the weight of his job as a marketing executive. He was overworked, stressed, and increasingly worn out. The idea of escaping the chaos for a little while appealed to him. Margaret's house, despite its decay and neglect, seemed like the perfect place to find some peace and solitude. The idea of selling the house and moving on crossed his mind as soon as he read the letter, but he decided to visit it first. After all, it had been part of the family for so long. Perhaps there were things inside worth keeping, old family photographs, letters, mementos that might help him reconnect with a part of his past he had long since abandoned. He booked a leave of absence and packed his things. The drive to the house took over an hour, winding through long stretches of highway and narrow country roads, eventually leading Mark to a path lined with towering trees. He had arrived. When he finally saw the house through the trees, it almost startled him. It was bigger than he remembered, taller and more imposing, like a shadow looming over the land. The once sturdy porch sagged, and the windows were cloudy, as if obscured by time and neglect. The front door was ajar, as though it had been waiting for him. As he stepped over the threshold, an unsettling feeling crept up his spine. The house smelled old, dust, mildew, and something else he couldn't quite identify, something familiar yet disturbing. The air was stale, unmoving, as if the house itself had been holding its breath for years. The first few days were spent sorting through the clutter. The furniture was covered in dusty sheets, and the floors creaked underfoot as Mark made his way through the rooms. The walls were lined with old paintings and photographs, the faces of distant relatives and strangers staring at him from the frames. But something felt off. The house had an unnatural stillness. In the study, Mark discovered stacks of books left open, their pages faded and brittle. Many were in Latin or languages he couldn't read, their titles hinting at dark, arcane subjects. One book, titled Malum Umbra, was filled with strange symbols that seemed to writhe on the page when he stared too long. Mark dismissed it as a trick of his tired eyes and placed it back on the shelf, but a nagging unease lingered. On the third day, Mark decided to tackle the upstairs. He had avoided the second floor at first, not wanting to confront the memories of his aunt's strange life. She had lived up there alone for the past decade, and he knew little about the way she spent her time. When he climbed the stairs and reached the landing, he noticed something strange. A door at the end of the hall he hadn't spotted before. The rest of the rooms upstairs had been untouched, frozen in time, with furniture draped in old sheets and yellowed wallpaper curling at the edges. But this door, Mark couldn't remember ever seeing it before. In all his childhood visits, in all the times he'd wandered through the house, this door had never been there. It was almost as though it had materialized out of nowhere. Mark approached the door slowly, the hairs on the back of his neck rising. He reached for the doorknob, and as his fingers brushed against it, a chill ran through him. He turned it, the old metal groaning in protest as the door creaked open. Inside was a small, dimly lit room, bare except for a single wooden chair in the center. The floor was covered in dust, untouched for years, and the walls were covered in photographs, but not ones he recognized. Faces he didn't know stared at him with hollow, vacant eyes. Their expressions were unsettling, some smiling, some frowning, some with their eyes closed as if they were caught in a moment of frozen terror. Mark's heart began to race. He stepped further into the room, his footsteps loud in the silence. The room felt oppressive, like it was suffocating him. As he moved closer to the walls, his eyes fell on the photographs more closely. One face froze him in place. It was Margaret, standing among a group of people in what looked like a ritual, her hands raised, a shadowy figure faintly visible behind her. Another photo showed Mark as a child, sitting on the porch of this very house. He didn't remember the photo being taken, but there he was, staring back at himself. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped, and he felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle in his chest. A memory began to surface, unbidden. Margaret's strange humming on hot summer nights, the smell of burning herbs, and a locked door he had been forbidden to open. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but his body wouldn't comply. Something was pulling him back into the room, an invisible force tightening around him like a noose. The air grew heavier, the shadows deepened, and he swore he heard a faint whisper. "Mark." The following days passed in a blur. Mark's behavior grew more erratic. He would wake in strange places, holding objects he didn't recognize. An old, rusted knife, a leather-bound journal filled with Margaret's handwriting, symbols and rituals scrawled in the margins. He found himself humming the same melody Margaret used to hum, his voice echoing in the silent halls. He didn't even realize he was doing it until the sound startled him. He avoided the upstairs room, but it haunted him. In his dreams, the photographs came alive, the faces whispering secrets he couldn't understand. He saw Margaret performing rituals in the dead of night, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. And always, he felt the pull of the house, as if it had claimed him the moment he stepped inside. On the fifth night, Mark woke to find himself standing in the mysterious room. The photographs seemed to shift in the dim light, the faces now glaring at him, accusing him. And then he heard it, a voice, deep and resonant, speaking from the shadows. "Welcome home, Mark. We've been waiting." The room spun, and a flood of memories washed over him. Margaret's rituals, the strange symbols carved into the furniture, the chants he had heard as a child but had long buried. It had all been leading to this. The last thing he remembered was the feeling of cold hands on his shoulders, pulling him into the darkness as the voice whispered one final word. "Mine."